I'll be talking about the novel in terms of the three themes of morbidity, eros, and paternity. That's just one thread that runs through the novel, but I hope it will be a pathway for you into the novel or to return to the novel. Speaking of undergraduates, you may have seen in the advertisement for this lecture that my tag was the visit by a University of Chicago undergraduate to Thomas Mann when he was living in Pacific Palisades, California. Here we see him in 1948. In 1949, the young Susan Sontag, who would go on to become one of the most prominent critics, certainly, and writers in the United States during her lifetime, visited him. She was completely enthralled with the Magic Mountain, and I hope I can convince you that you should be enthralled with the Magic Mountain as well. Thomas Mann, in his study in Pacific Palisades, this is not a Cinzano advertisement, although you will note that he is sipping a glass of Cinzano there. He is just about to see the publication of Dr. Faustus. I'll come back to that in a moment. But beforehand, I'd like to turn to an earlier picture of Thomas Mann. This is Thomas Mann, roughly at the age of 25-6, that is to say, at the age at which he published his first novel, The Buddenbrooks. Let's take a look at this picture and see if we can decode it. What do you notice first? My guess is that you will notice the collar. This is a man who wears a stiff collar. This is a man who wears cuffs and very, very ornate, as you can just see there, very ornate cufflinks. This is a man who is dressed to a T. This is a man whose desk is ornately decorated with little works of art that obviously are meaningful to him. This is a bourgeois writer. This is a man who comes out of an upper middle class background in the 19th century. This is Thomas Buddenbrooks from the Buddenbrooks novel, if you will, and it's also Hans Castorp, the hero of the Magic Mountain. Thomas Mann was always writing about himself. I stress the rigor, the sense of responsibility, the sense of civic representation in the dress of Thomas Mann as we see him here. But notice too, there's a little exhaustion in the head. He's leaning on that hand, and he's looking sleepily and dreamily into the distance. This doubleness of the bourgeoisie and a sense of exhaustion and dreaminess is characteristic of Thomas Mann throughout his work, and it is characteristic in particular of Hans Castorp, a young engineer who can't really get his studies done, who is sleepy and dreamy and embarks on a completely different kind of adventure. Allow me to review very briefly here Thomas Mann's career. I like to think of it as unfolding in stages of 25 years. At the age of 25, he publishes Buddenbrooks, for which he will later receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Almost exactly 25 years later comes The Magic Mountain, which many people regard as his greatest achievement. And finally, in 1948, that's a mistake, 1948, Dr. Faustus, The Life of the Composer Adrian Leverkühn, Thomas Mann's engagement, his critical engagement with the avant-gardist movement of the arts, but also his engagement with German history as it was unfolding during the 1940s. I like to say that Dr. Faustus is the greatest novel written by an American in the 20th century, because at this time Thomas Mann was indeed an American citizen. And at this time too, he had also had a successful but very, very strenuous operation, surgical operation. He had cancer of the lung at the University of Chicago, University of Chicago Hospital. Thomas Mann's career does not consist of these three novels alone, and some brief recommendations here. I've listed only a few of the major works, and I want to highlight just a couple for you to call them to mind. Of course, the greatest novella of the German language, 1912, Death in Venice, is something that you don't want to forget. I was speaking about Reflections of an Unpolitical Man and his essay, The German Republic, in a moment. But these are absolutely crucial for understanding Thomas Mann's political self-understanding. In 1930, Mario and the Magician appears, another novella, another masterpiece, and it is Thomas Mann's most sustained engagement with the phenomenon of fascism at this time, taking place in Italy. And of course, I do not want to forget the great tetralogy Joseph and His Brothers, the 4 Joseph novels, Thomas Mann's retelling of the biblical story in 4 volumes. In the last volume, 1943, completed in the United States, of course, Joseph the Provider, where the figure of Joseph has the figure of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the background. Thomas Mann met Franklin Delano Roosevelt on 2 occasions and was deeply, deeply impressed by him. But let's move on to the Magic Mountain. The Magic Mountain takes place in Davos, Switzerland, and here we see a picture of it. And the reason the picture of it is here is to alert you to the fact that there's lots and lots of snow in Davos, Switzerland, and that will come to play an absolutely crucial role in the novel. In 1913, Thomas Mann spent 3 weeks at Davos in the sanatorium. His wife Katja was being treated in the sanatorium, and he visited her and stayed there for 3 weeks. And during that time, he conceived of a brief, humorous novella, which later expanded 1913, 24, if you think about it, 11 years later appeared as the novel The Magic Mountain. If we read The Magic Mountain, in addition to the sanatorium, which he calls Berghof, the fictional sanatorium, only one other sanatorium is mentioned. It's called Schatzalp, and Schatzalp indeed existed. That's the one where Thomas Mann's wife Katja stayed. Schatzalp is still in existence today, but not as a sanatorium. I want to call your attention here to the fact that this model for what we will have in the novel is very interesting, because Thomas Mann quite literally takes over the architectural structure here. Every room, every patient's room has its own separate balcony. And these balconies are absolutely crucial, because it's on the balcony that you go out and you lie down on a kind of chaise structure, at least for 3 hours a day, breathing in the clear air. One does this even in winter. It is a leading motif in the novel. It's the motif of what Thomas Mann calls the horizontal way of life. The horizontal way of life. And that horizontal way of life is a way of life that you just sink into, yielding yourself up to dream and reverie. It is a posture, if you will, that is close to the posture of death. And of course, that is taking us immediately to the first of my topics, to the theme of morbidity. From his position on the balcony, Hans Castorp can view various sorts of events that are going on. For instance, the threatened suicide outside, scaring all the young ladies of the sanatorium, by a certain Herr Alpin. And of course, the novel will have a suicide, 2 suicides, now that I think of it, as its high point, a kind of radical act that has something to do with what this novel is about. It is also where he can view in the winter one of the more grotesque aspects of the novel, and that is that the corpses of those who have died at the sanatorium, and of course that's a regular ongoing thing that happens there, are transported in winter out by sled. So you have a kind of bobsledding down the hill, which he can watch from there. What we're seeing here is a tendency in the novel to combine the topic of death and the reverence that one has toward the dead on the one hand, with an emphasis on a grotesque, indeed macabre element on the other. There is a kind of comic juxtaposition of these two that characterizes particularly the first part of the novel. We'll see this theme running throughout. Thomas Mann, of course, was familiar with the theme of death from his childhood on. He was raised in a Lutheran church, and here we have a depiction that he saw as a young man in Lübeck of the famous medieval dance of death, the Totentanz. And this genre of the Totentanz, of the dance of death, has something of the grotesque, macabre character about it that Thomas Mann, in a slightly more slapstick fashion, captures as well in The Magic Mountain. So this, just to introduce you to that theme of morbidity that runs throughout. But the theme of morbidity, we have to realize, is a theme in this novel that applies not simply to the physical characters to the medical situation, let us say, to the medical situation on the Magic Mountain. It applies to the whole state of society and culture as Thomas Mann is experiencing at this time. I'll be probing that theme a little bit more in depth in a moment, but let's recall something very important. Hans Castorp in this novel, and that is the story that the novel tells, comes to the Magic Mountain, comes to the sanatorium where his cousin Joachim is staying. He comes for a brief visit, just as Thomas Mann had come for a brief visit, but he ends up staying for 7 years. He ends up staying for 7 years. This is a novel about time. It is a time novel, a novel about its time and about time itself, in the spirit of Proust, in the spirit of Henri Bergson. It is a novel, a modernist novel about time. But it is a novel about its time, and its time is viewed by Thomas Mann as a time of decadence. The attraction of decadence was something that he internally felt himself. The years I mentioned, 7 years, we know exactly what years those are. Those are the years 1917 to 1914. What we are looking at here is the precedents, the years leading up to the First World War. Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain is, in a certain sense, an effort to come to an understanding of what kind of, shall we say, state of mind, what kind of state of mind could make that horrible, horrible event, the event of the First World War, come into being. The Magic Mountain ends with our hero, Hans Castorp, after 7 years, suddenly returning. The last chapter shows him on the fields of Flanders. Thomas Mann shifts from the past of narration into a kind of present depiction, almost a cinematic depiction of Hans Castorp running across the fields of Flanders with bombs falling left and right, or mortars falling left and right, I should say. The dance of death, that theme of the macabre, is transformed by World War I into a horrific macabre dance, as depicted here in this, a typical German expressionist reaction to World War I, in this case by the artist Otto Dix. So that is the temporal, the historical environment of this novel. That is what this novel is coming to terms with. And even as it comes to terms with the experience of mortality on an individual level and the experience of disease on an individual level, is at the same time commenting on very broad streams of the culture that we can gather together under the concept of decadence. We'll explore that a little bit more fully in just a moment, but I want you to see that larger project that we have in the novel. The novel is not merely about individuals, it is about the time in which the action here takes place and about the entire cultural background of that period. Let's go back to Switzerland. Let's return and look now. This is the Schatzalp, in other words, the model for the Sanatorium Berghof in the Magic Mountain. I wanted you to see it from a distant photo because this gives me an opportunity to highlight the structure of the novel. As I said, Hans Castorp comes to the sanatorium and remains there for 7 years, abdicating his responsibilities, his plans, his sense of ambition and instead exploring the temptations, let us say, and the challenges that he meets with up there. There is something captivating about that sanatorium for him, just as there is something bizarre and off-putting. It sets him on an adventure. The important feature of the novel, as far as its structure is concerned, then, is this sense of enclosure, this almost claustrophobic sense of being caught in that sanatorium. But at the same time, Thomas Mann builds into the novel three excursions out into that landscape. And I need to briefly review those three excursions for you. That gives you the basic rhythm of the novel. There are three exits from the sanatorium, and then there will be the final exit at the end of the novel when Hans Castorp returns to the lowlands, as they're called, to the lowlands in order to enter the war. The first excursion is a very brief excursion, his first time out. It takes place in the springtime. I believe it's in the springtime. Maybe in autumn, I'm not sure. In any case, he goes for a walk for the first time. Patients are not encouraged to do this, and so there's a certain violation of the order of the sanatorium as he does this. He walks out, he feels strong, he feels that he can go on, but suddenly he begins to get dizzy. He's struck by a nosebleed. He falls weakened down. He lays down on a bench and indeed falls into a kind of half-sleep in which a peculiar dream comes to him, and it's a dream from his childhood. A dream from his childhood, from a school episode in his childhood when a young boy, a boy of Eastern, probably Polish background, a boy by the name of Czibisław Hippe, who is fascinating for young Hans Castorp. Czibisław Hippe lent Hans Castorp his pencil. That little episode appears to him in a dream vision, and that episode, that childhood episode, it turns out, is formative of the, of the erotic imaginary of Hans Castorp. That's what will turn out here. So the first vision outside is a vision of love, but is of love not understood. The second excursion is arguably the high point of the novel. It is the chapter Snow. Hans Castorp decides to go out into the snow. This is not a good idea. He ends up, he's on skis, he's on sort of cross-country skis. He ends up in a storm in which he becomes completely disoriented. If any of you have ever had an experience like that, you know that it can be terrifying. And he thinks that he has figured out what direction he needs to go in. He heads off in that direction, and after a rather arduous working his way through the snow, ends up exactly at the point that he had departed from when he tried to make his way back. He realizes he's not going to make his way back. He must lie down and wait for the storm to pass. He does that. He lies down in the half shelter of one of these little mountain. They're little mountain sheds that are built where various tools are stored, and he lies down in the shade, a slight protection of that. And here he has a dream. Again, it is a dream vision that comes to him on the outside. And that dream vision this time is the dream vision that is the high point of the novel. It is a dream vision that takes him actually all the way to Greece. And it takes him to the experience of a society in Greece that is a society that lives in beauty. It is a society in which beauty and art and social togetherness are inseparable. A society of pure beauty, until he discovers that behind that beauty there is another reality, and that reality is the reality of human sacrifice. It is a vision of the extremes of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. It is a vision that is inspired by the thought of Nietzsche, who is one of the thinkers who most forcefully influenced Thomas Mann. The third time out, And in a certain sense, this is another high point of the novel. And you must see each of these excursions is an echo of the first, the third of the second, and so forth. The third time out is the trip that he takes with a group of people that has become the repertoire of the novel. And they go outside on a kind of picnic. At this time, the latest guest at the novel, the dominating figure of the last phase of the novel, or rather the penultimate phase of the novel, Peter Papercorn, the great Dutch coffee merchant, who has come to the Magic Mountain and come to the sanatorium, accompanied by Clave de Chauchat, the woman whom Hans Castorp loved, who comes then as Hans Castorp's rival, his erotic rival. And they make an excursion out, and the culminating scene there is the scene where Peter Papercorn, a man of tremendous vitality, a man of sheer physical power, a man who lives in the moment, a man who drinks copiously, stands in front of the waterfall, stands in front of the current as it comes pouring down, and screams into the current. But of course, his voice is inaudible in comparison with the rush of the water. It is the defeat, the symbolic defeat of that principle of sheer vitality that Peter Papercorn had attempted to live. I'll come back to him in a moment. The trip to the Magic Mountain is realistically described in detail, but what we must realize is that Thomas Mann, in talking about a young man heading into a mountain and in some way being captivated, especially romantically or erotically, drawing on the unconscious, captivated in that way, that is actually an old story. And it was a story that was particularly activated by the Romantics. The attraction of the mountains, the extreme experience of the mountains, captured on this book cover, which reproduces the famous painting, the most famous painting perhaps, second most famous painting by the great German Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich. That is used as the color illustration for a collection of two stories by the Romantic writer, and one of those stories is called Der Runenberg, the mountain of runes, the mountain where the hero of the story goes out and discovers, of course, a kind of demonic female figure who instructs him in a magical language of runes. The trip into the mountains and the trip into erotic captivation is a major Romantic theme, even though it precedes Romanticism, indeed goes all the way back into the Middle Ages. It is perhaps most famously actualized in Richard Wagner's 1845 opera Tannhauser. And here you have a portrait of Wagner, and you can see on this portrait that he had an intense sense of his own artistic mission. He's rather... he tended to costume himself a bit as an artist. The mountain is real. It is Davos, Switzerland, but it is also a mythic mountain and a mythic site. It is rooted in German Romanticism, as I indicated. But perhaps the most famous rendering of that is the Tannhauser myth, is that medieval myth that Richard Wagner had reactivated. And here we see a painting, a mural, actually, a wall painting, in the castle of King Ludwig of Bavaria. Of course, that young king who had so supported Richard Wagner, a real devotee of Richard Wagner, and he had this illustration to Tannhauser painted on his wall. And what we see here, of course, is the magico-erotic captivation of the Tannhauser figure. The major thing about this myth is that one has to escape from this cave. Now, in Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, there is a woman figure who also captivates our hero. And her name is Claudia Chauchat. Claudia Chauchat, I know you want to see a picture of Claudia Chauchat, and you will in a moment. But she captivates him from the very beginning. The first time he notices her is when she enters the dining hall where everyone dines. She always arrives late, and she always slams the door. It's irritating, but you can't help but turn around. And when you turn around, you watch her walking across the room. I've highlighted a couple of aspects of that walk. She walked soundlessly with a peculiar slinking gait. I want you to try to think about what a peculiar slinking gait might be. And as she walked, she kept one hand in the pocket of her close-fitting wool jacket. You see how sharp Thomas Mann's eye for detail can be. He can really do that at the same time that he's creating a mythic world. She kept one hand in the pocket of her close-fitting wool jacket while the other was busy at the back of her head, tucking and arranging her hair. It's absolutely fascinating the way Thomas Mann focuses or lets Hans Castorp focus on the back of her neck. That is one of the features that he becomes attached to. And it's attachment that we're talking about here. It's erotic fascination and attachment. The hand tucking up her hair, and now something that would be impossible to see at any distance, but nonetheless, it's as if Hans Castorp can see it and knows it, and it is true. The hand tucking up her hair was not particularly ladylike, not refined or well cared for, not in the way ladies in young Hans Castorp's social circle cared for them. The cuticles had a jagged look, as if she'd been biting her nails. This is the point where that bourgeois, rather stiff young Hans Castorp is confronted with an image that he can't resist the pull of, but nevertheless is an image that suggests something off, wrong, transgressive, improper. And that's the pull that is going to drag him in, bring him in to his relationship with Claudia Chauchat. Hans Castorp caught a fleeting glance of her broad cheekbones and narrow eyes, and at the sight, a vague memory of something or somebody brushed over him. It brushed over him, that memory. It doesn't really come to a conscious thematic attention. It just whisks by. You've probably had that experience sometimes when someone, something reminds you of something, but you're not sure what. But we as readers know what it is. What he is reminded of here is the Slavic face of Přibyslav Hippe, the young boy who had given him that pencil in the scene from his childhood. Whether that scene actually took place or was only a dream scene, we do not know. She is the recrudescence of that dream. She is the return of Přibyslav Hippe, now in a different version altogether. That first perception of Claudia Chauchat will be repeated soon after in another dream that Hans Castorp has in his horizontal mode of life out on the balcony, where he drifts off and he dreams, and there he sees her wearing her white sweater, one hand in her pocket, the other at the back of her head. I've heard those words before. Those are the exact same words. They appear or reappear here rhythmically throughout the novel. Almost every time she appears, we know that she has her hand on the back of her head. That is one of the things that comes from Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner's leitmotif technique, the technique that allowed him to establish continuity through those epic-length operas that he composed, by creating a kind of tonal signature for either themes or characters. Let's take the sword of Siegfried, for instance. The leitmotif attached to the sword of Siegfried is "No tung das Schwert." I'm glad that Anne Robertson has left. My musicological dean was a rather risky thing. In any case, that appears again and again whenever Siegfried is about to approach, whenever a battle is about to ensue, that comes up. Wagner's operas are interwoven with these leitmotifs, and Thomas Mann uses the same technique. And with that technique of the leitmotif, he ensnarls the reader. We can follow him without even following him consciously, because we understand what that hand at the back of the neck means. And then notice that the dream takes things one step further. And that hand that had the rather roughly or ill-cared-for cuticles now becomes something else. It becomes an open hand that he kisses. She gives him her hand, but not like this to kiss, but like this to kiss, in a flagrantly erotic gesture. And that dream brings about in Hans Castorp the sense of dissolute sweetness that had rose up within him. We are here now in the second theme, right in the middle of the second theme that I talked about at the beginning, or that I noted at the beginning, the theme of eros. And this novel is the novel about a passage through eros, and the passage through an erotic adventure. That passage through the erotic adventure is a passage through a space in which eros and morbidity are complexly intertwined with one another. And that intertwinement occurs in the figure of Claudia Chauchat. Now, it is true of Thomas Mann generally, I think, that his major characters are typically drawn from a real character. Sometimes they are composites of several real characters. The composer Adrian Leverkühn, for instance, in Dr. Faustus, his life follows the life pattern of Friedrich Nietzsche. I already indicated at the beginning that Thomas Mann himself reappears, at least in the figure of Hans Castorp, and definitely in the figure of Thomas Buddenbrooks. So who is it, perhaps, that is behind the figure of Claudia Chauchat? A complex question. It's not a question of depicting that person. It's a question of drawing, as it were, drawing imaginative energy from the figure, from reality that you have chosen. I have a thought about that, and I'm not sure that it is a thought that has been developed in the secondary literature. But my thought is that the paradigm, the model for Claudia Chauchat is Lou Andreas Salome. Lou Andreas Salome was one of the most significant women of the first part of the 20th century. She, of course, had a close relationship with Nietzsche. In the photograph on the left, you see her in a famous photograph that she took with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the one with the mustache, of course, and it's the Paul Ray, a British sociologist with whom they were also friendly. There was a kind of triangle that took place there, had serious negative consequences for Nietzsche's life, that particular triangle. She was later very intensely involved with Rainer Maria Rilke, perhaps the greatest German language poet of that part of the century. She took Rilke with her to Russia. She was Russian. She was married, just as Claudia Chauchat is. She's Eastern, that Eastern attraction is there. And she later became a student of Sigmund Freud, and Freud was very, very taken with her intelligence. Indeed, she produced a number of publications on most famous, a 1910 book entitled Eros. That is Lou Andreas Salome. And this photograph of Lou Andreas Salome captures her captivating quality. It also captures her neck. Chauchat is her name. Claudia Chauchat. Let's not just think of Lou Andreas Salome. Let us think of that, what was the phrase? The slinking way that she had of walking. that cat-like mode of movement. Let's think for a moment of cats, for example. Let's think of the great mid-19th century poet Charles Baudelaire and his poem Les Chats, where the figure of the cat is a figure of a kind of nightly intoxication, a figure of eros, but a figure also of mystical speculation, a kind of muse for the poet. This is the beginning of a decadent figuration of the cat. And of course the cat is associated for Baudelaire also with the figure of the prostitute. All we have to do is leap up 10 years into the next decade. Baudelaire's great decade is the 1850s. That's when the Fleur du Mal appears, 57, I believe. 1866, perhaps the most decadent writer of the British 19th century is Swinburne, and here is his praise of Venus. Let's just take a look at this. Asleep or waking is it, for her neck, kissed over close, wears yet a purple speck wherein the pained blood falters and goes out. This is the fusion of eros and morbidity. This is the fusion of eros and morbidity. It is suggestively there with the cats of hell that are surrounding the cat that Baudelaire is talking about in Baudelaire. But here it is made, and it is made a theme. So what we have in Claudia Chauchat, and it's Claudia Chauchat who holds Hans Castorp on the mountain. It's Claudia Chauchat who magically captivates him. What we have in her is, as it were, the priestess of this magic mountain, the priestess of a union of eros and morbidity. This will culminate, and it is the first point of culmination in the novel, in the scene entitled Walpurgisnacht. Walpurgisnacht, that's a scene from Goethe's Faust. It's the scene of the witches' Sabbath in Goethe's Faust, and that is the night where, in the carnival celebration, from the carnival celebration, Hans Castorp and Claudia Chauchat leave together and spend the night together. The next day she leaves. The next day she leaves the magic mountain. She's gone. And now he can't leave either because he has to wait for her to return. So she has completely captivated him and attached him to the magic mountain. But I must tell you something about that night. I must tell you something about that night because that night is already the beginning of a breakthrough. That night, when Thomas Mann, I should say that, when Hans Castorp and Claudia Chauchat are together, Hans Castorp, quite miraculously, begins speaking to her in French. Well, I suppose it's good advice if we're on an erotic adventure, but the thing that's really strange about this is that what he's saying to her in French is he is repeating a translation, a French translation of Walt Whitman's poem from Leaves of Grass, I Sing the Body Electric. I Sing the Body Electric. Isn't that amazing that Walt Whitman, the great American poet, also of the 1850s, by the way, The Leaves of Grass, enters in. I sing the body of electric, the love of the body of man or woman, box accounts, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into it in complete detail. Now, why does that happen? Why does that happen? In order to answer that question, we have to go to Thomas Mann's essay, The German Republic, or Of a German Republic. 1922. Thomas Mann in 1918 had published his Reflections of a Non-Political Man. At that time, he had said that Germany, following the First World War, Germany must seek a neutral position. It must not turn to the West. It must not turn to the democracies of the West. It must rather keep a neutral position between East and West. Eastward, he's looking, of course, to Russia. That's 1918, and is generally regarded as a testimony of or let us say, politically conservative to reactionary position on the part of Thomas Mann. In 1922, of a German republic, he comes out and explicitly states his support of a republican form of government. Now, you have to realize what kind of chaos we're going through from 1918 into the 1920s in Germany. The defeat, the overthrowing of the Kaiser, the revolution that has taken place, starting with the Sailors' Revolution in Hamburg. People are being shot on the street. There's complete chaos. Finally, to decide in favor of the Republic, the Weimar Republic that is firmly established at the beginning of the 1920s. All right? And now Thomas Mann, certainly regarded as one of the most important writers in Germany, and a man who had been regarded as a fairly conservative writer, comes out in favor of the Republic. And that essay has some remarkable things in it. It has a meditation on Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, the representative of an American democratic spirit, in the spirit of poetry, is one of the heroes of that essay. Let's look at the second block quotation that I have here. If you like, all poetry is disease, since all is profoundly, inseparably, incurably bound up with ideas of beauty and death. That is the morbidity, the artist's temptation, the relationship between beauty and death. Even that primeval athletic poetry of Walt Whitman, bursting with ethnic freshness, which just now let us bring into touch for a moment democracy and aestheticism. And now the crucial thing. But is not poesy life through itself? Let poets love the sea for the sake of death, yet it is not said that out of the sea comes life? It may be that sympathy with death is vicious only when death sets itself up as opposed to life, as an independent spiritual force. Indeed, that's what has happened at this historical moment in Thomas Mann's analysis. That is what happened. And Whitman is a figure for a literature that passes through that accepts death as a part of life, but not allowing death to take dominion over our thought. And so that's what has happened now if we look back with a poem from Walt Whitman that Hans Castorp has recited to her. What's happened in that night, in that erotic union, is an overcoming of the morbid side of love, is an affirmation of a love that doesn't cling to the, as it were, decadent morbidity that is characteristic of the first phase of the novel and characteristic of the entire atmosphere at the Berghof Sanatorium. I have to then quickly say something about the fact that there are two pedagogues in this novel. That after the departure of Claude Chauchat, Hans Castorp finds himself in the middle, and it's very interesting that he's in the middle, the center, the point of compromise, the mediation of extremes. That is for Thomas Mann the place of the human. The place of the human is in the middle. He finds himself, as it were, caught in the middle of a rivalry between two pedagogues who are competing for his soul. One of them is the figure of Settembrini, the Italian writer, the writer who brags that he has had the honor of publishing the obituary of Carducci in a German newspaper. Now, one thing about Settembrini one must note is that that's his only publication. He comes off as a learned man, but he actually hasn't gotten much down on paper. He's a talker, and therefore he is often referred to as the organ grinder. He's the person who always has something to say and is always grinding away. So in a certain sense, what we have here is a satirical extreme. We have an enlightenment Enlightenment as the freedom from prejudice, as the ascent to a point where we make our own decisions on our own in cooperation with one another. That notion of the Enlightenment that fed itself into the American Constitution, for instance, that's where we come from. That Enlightenment, when we get to the beginning of the 20th century, to that period, 1907 to 1914, has hardened into a kind of pedantry, an ineffectual pedantry that can no longer make a claim to a public resonance, if you will. The other figure on the other side who is competing with Settembrini for Hans Castorp's soul is the figure Leo Napfte. Leo Napfte, born a Jew, become a Jesuit, a mystic, a nihilist, and a communist. A man of the East, a man with deep sympathies for Russia, but at the same time, as a Jesuit, a man of the far, far West, that is to say, of Spain, the most, as it were, rigidly authoritarian, the home of the Jesuit movement. He is patterned after a real figure. He is patterned after the critic Georg Lukács, the Hungarian critic who was in Heidelberg at the time of that Max Weber was there, the famous Heidelberg Circle of Intellectuals, and who in 1920 wrote a brilliant, brilliant book, one of the great works of criticism of the 20th century, which he called The Theory of the Novel. Lukács later, of course, became a cultural minister in the communist government in Hungary and had a rather disreputable ending to his career. But the first phase of his career and his advocacy of literary realism and his great, great advocacy of Thomas Mann characterize him. He must have been a brilliant rhetorician. His writing is that way. And Napfte is also a brilliant rhetorician who has little trouble in tying Settembrini up in the contradictions of his somewhat more simplistic Enlightenment position. Between Settembrini and Napfte, we see the conflict of two different aesthetics. The conflict of a classical aesthetic drawn from the image of the Greeks that insists on the perfection of this worldly sensuous being, beauty as the perfection of the here and now, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a radically Catholic art, an art of sufferance, an art of spirituality, an art that is not meant for us to abide in sensuality, but to, through the movement of our pity, to overcome that. That is the battle that's being fought verbally fought out over Hans Castorp's soul. And so what happens is that Hans Castorp, caught between these two poles in a state of confusion, has to go out for himself and find something for himself. He has to enter into the barrenness where life comes up against the background of death, where human meaning is set against the background of the undifferentiated snow. He must go out into that kind of atmosphere that we find in Caspar David Friedrich's Sea of Ice from 1823 and 24. He must expose himself to that nothingness in order to come to his own understanding of where he is in life. That is what happens in that chapter, Snow, that I referred to before, the very high point of the novel. And it is in the chapter Snow, then, that he comes to his understanding of what it is to be human. Man is the master of contradictions. You can see a person who has been passing through contradictions, Settembrini on the one hand and Napfte on the other. Man is the master of contradictions. They occur through him, and so he is more noble than they, more noble than death, too noble for it. That is the freedom of his mind, more noble than life, too noble for it. That is the devotion of his heart. Heart and mind must come together. He must be in the middle of those two forces. He cannot have, as it were, a flatly optimistic view of this worldliness. He must also have a sympathy with the other side, but he must also affirm this world here. Love turns out to be the word that carries the burden here of his insight in the snow. Love stands opposed to death. It alone and not reason is stronger than death. Only love and not reason yields kind, good, one might say, thoughts of goodness, one might say, translating it a little bit more accurately here. I will keep faith with death in my heart, but I will clearly remember that if faithfulness to death and to what is past rules our thoughts and deeds, that leads only to wickedness, dark lust, and hatred of mankind. That is the rejection of morbidity, the overcoming of morbidity, but not by a repression that denies that love is death is part of life, but rather that finds a way toward an affirmation in the name of love. That is the insight of the snow chapter. It comes to him in a dream. It comes to him in a dream. So basically what we've had are dream 1, the dream of love, Chibislav Hippe, dream 2, and that is, as I say, the high point of the novel. But that message about love can't just be carried in as a kind of maxim of life. It has to be lived. And in order for it to be lived, one has to pass through another passage, and that is the encounter with Papercorn, the last figure who appears in the novel. Papercorn doesn't return, comes to the sanatorium. He's ill, he is sick. He comes to the sanatorium and he's accompanied by his mistress, and his mistress is Claudia Shosha. The initial thing that happens between Papercorn and Hans Castorp is a beautifully, beautifully described, subtle sense of rivalry. But let's pause for a moment and see. I want to stress here what I call the onomastic imagination of Thomas Mann. No one came up with better names for his characters. No one came up with better names for his characters than Thomas Mann. And Peter Papercorn, the Dutch coffee merchant, the man who did a lot of dealing in the far, far east. What about that alliteration of Peter Papercorn? What about the peppercorn, in other words, pepper kernels, what little pepper kernels? What about that word? Think of the alliteration in that tongue twister that we speak here. Peter Piper picked a pack of pickled peppers. That is a way in which alliteration becomes a great comic device. Plays on words and plays on the sounds of words have, since the beginning, been one of the great comic forces. It was Mozart and Schikaneder, I should say, who mobilized that in the Magic Flute. Right? Papageno, Papageno we hear in the Magic Flute. Who is Papageno? Papageno is the human being. He is not Tamino. He's not the figure of virtue. He is a human being. He is weak. He is good, sometimes. And he catches birds. Peter Papercorn has something of the comic figure of Papageno in him. He has something of the fool, but he is the greatest and grandest figure of this novel. The novel has as its greatest and grandest figure a man who is something of a fool. Remember the great eloquence of Settembrini and Napfta, the great eloquence of words. Those word salads that were coming at Hans Castorp from both directions. Papercorn's typical speech is something like this. Well, let's then, you're good, wonderful, bah! That's the sort of thing he does. He is a man of gesture. He's a man of vocal expression, but not verbal expression. He's a man of the body. That's who Papercorn is. Peter Papercorn has a model from real life. It's the German poet, the great dramatist, one of the great dramatists of the first part of the 20th century, Gerhard Hauptmann. Gerhard Hauptmann, when he read Magic Mountain, realized that the figure of Peter Papercorn, the figure of this inarticulate almost buffoon figure was patterned on himself. What would you do in that situation? What Gerhard Hauptmann did, and I want to mention this, I think it is worth remembering. He nominated Thomas Mann for the Nobel Prize. That's what we call magnanimity. That is magnanimity in the literal sense of the word, greatness of soul. One has to admire it. In Papercorn, there is a magnificent drunken scene. It's the scene of the picnic. No, it's not the scene of the picnic. It's before that. It's a magnificent drunken scene when afterwards Papercorn is so, after this feast that he has put on and over which he is lorded over, he cannot make it back to his room. And Hans Castorp and Claudia Chauchat each take one of his arms and help him back. Here it is. It's Rubens' drunken Silenus. It's Rubens' Bacchus figure, who needs help, who stumbles forward. And this, my friends, is the whole point that I've been working toward. This point, where Claudia Chauchat on one arm and Hans Castorp on the other arm realize that the nature of their love is their solidarity in caring for this man. That is the point where eros becomes love. In the course of this novel, the rivalry, the potential Oedipal rivalry between Papercorn and Hans Castorp will be overcome, and it will be overcome in a spirit of shared devotion and care. And that is really the drift of the novel. Papercorn is a Bacchus figure. He is a Dionysian figure, but he is also a Christ figure. It is the fusion of Christian and Greek mythology, the fusion of Dionysus and Christ. Also an inheritance of German Romanticism, particularly in the work of the greatest of the German poets of that era, lyric poets of that era, Hölderlin. We see that attempt to think Dionysus and Christ together. And that's what Thomas Mann is recapitulating in his depiction of Papercorn. But there's one more thing that comes through. And that's where I want to end right now, exactly on time. and that is this. Hans Castorp, in his little journey of 7 years, we must remember, is an orphan. Both his parents died very early. He doesn't even remember them. He is raised by his grandfather. His grandfather dies when he's about 10. That's the experience of death that attaches itself to him. The longest flashback going into Hans Castorp's youth, near the beginning of the novel, is the story of the death of the grandfather, and is the experience of viewing his grandfather before. His grandfather is an important figure in the town of Lübeck. Hans Castorp, who is in search of a way through life, is a fatherless young man. And finally, what he finds, I already mentioned the aspect of potential Oedipal conflict. Finally, what he finds in Papercorn is the father that he'd never had, but the father to whom he can commit himself, together with Claudia Chauchat, in shared devotion to him. Morbidity, eros, paternity. That's the line through the novel that I'm suggesting that you consider when you return to it, and I do hope that you will all take it up. We have a new translation by John E. Woods, which is to be recommended. I hope you take it up, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks very much for your attention. Thank you.